shed the blood of man, and I shrunk and would that I might not slay him. And the Spirit said unto me again, Behold, the Lord hath delivered him into thy hands. Yea, and I also knew that he had sought to take away mine own life. Yea, and he would not hearken unto the commandments of the Lord, and he also had taken away our property. And it came to pass that the Spirit said unto me again, Slay him, for the Lord hath delivered him into thy hands. And again, I knew that the Lord had delivered Laban into my hands for this cause, that I might obtain the records according to the commandments. Now, I find this phraseology highly significant. This type of language is not uncommon in the Old Testament. It's used quite regularly, actually. However, this is the only place in the Book of Mormon that this concept occurs. Whenever we use this idea of deliverance or delivery in the Book of Mormon, it's always you're being delivered from evil, or you're being delivered from the evil one, or delivered from the grave, or from the hands of your enemy. Here, in both stories, we have God delivering the mighty man into the hands of the hero. It is possible, of course, that the phrasing in 1 Nephi is based somewhat on Exodus 21:13. Switch over to that. Especially given the context, Exodus 21:13 deals with accidental death, laws regarding prevention. This is dealing with accidental death, as you recall. And it actually says, And if a man lie not in wait, but God deliver him into his hands, then I will appoint a place whither he shall flee. There is some appropriateness to this context here. However, I believe that just as Zink pointed out, the phraseology in other parts of the Book of Mormon shows this literary dependence in the Old Testament, that here it adds to a growing argument of textual reliance, especially given this list of parallel similarities. Lastly, in that last section, which we don't have up anymore, which I probably can't go back to, it's okay. But we can. You'll notice that in both cases, we have this concept that the mighty man has defied the will of God. We have, in one case, we have Goliath, right, who is standing in defiance of the armies of the God of Israel. And in the first Nephi's account there, in verse 11, it says, He would not hearken unto the commandments of the Lord. So we also have this recognition that the mighty man is not a man of righteousness. There's some deserving part of this. This is divine retribution for his activities in his life. Okay, we're going to continue on with the last bit here. 1 Samuel 17:51. Therefore David ran and stood up upon the Philistine and drew and took his sword and drew it out of the sheath thereof and slew him and cut off his head therewith. In 1 Nephi 4:18, therefore I did obey the voice of the Spirit and took Laban by the hair of his head, and I smote off his head with his own sword. These parallels in these two verses have been widely recognized and really need no additional comment. The hero kills the mighty man with his own sword, decapitates in both cases. Now, the next direction I want to take this is this question of why Nephi includes this in the Book of Mormon. It seems kind of an odd. What was that? That's all I got for that. We're going to hurry really quickly here. I'm going to skip some stuff here. This deals largely with Nephi's authority as ruler and king of the Nephite peoples. And as was pointed out earlier, any other groups that they're with, clearly there's something to be said for putting yourself in the role of King David as the preeminent king of all Israel, going through the same steps. First, he's chosen by a heavenly messenger in much the same way. Who cares about your brothers? You're the chosen guy. And then he's following through in some of these similar actions. And I wanted to point out, especially if you'll there we go, already up there, he's ahead of me. That as recorded in 2 Nephi 5, this whole issue of who has the right to rule is critical to the Nephites at this point in time. In verse 34 there, it says that it suffices me, he says, to say that 40 years have passed away and we have already had wars and contentions with our brethren over this right of rulership. And continuing on, and I'm going to cut a couple things here. The third point I want to make here is in following the second aspect of his conclusion, we realize that the story, rather than dealing with the ministry, deals with this reign of legitimacy. I wanted to add at this point that the stories of David and Solomon and other early Israelite leaders were well known to the Nephite peoples as recorded on the brass plates. And I think this is significant. They often use examples. I mean, there's that famous thing in Jacob where they're dealing with the whole polygamy issue, where they have justified it based on the activities of Solomon and David. They are aware of the lives of these men, and so we can assume that they have some familiarity. Now, let's jump to something really fascinating here. And if we take a look at some of the higher criticism of the story of David and Goliath in the Old Testament, it's I believe, fair to say that there is a scholarly consensus that there is, in fact, two different source materials, an early source and a later source. The composites, the early source, consists of 1 Samuel 16, verses 14 to 23, 17, verses 1 to 11, 17, verses 32 to 40, 17, verses 42 to 48a, and 17, verse 49, and then 17, verses 51 and 54, with the later source containing all the rest of the material. This identification actually was not very difficult for them because the Septuagint actually omits most of that material representing a different tradition. If we go back to my list of sources that I use for the parallels, what you're going to notice is that Nephi quotes chapter 17, verses 4 to 11, which is the first part there. He then jumps immediately to a parallel in 1732, and then 1734 to 37, and so on and so forth. And what you'll notice is that every one of the references that he parallels is from that early source material. In fact, he doesn't seem to recognize that any of the later source material exists, which is highly fascinating. Now, if you can jump to the next slide, you probably won't be able to. Go ahead, and we're going to come through the one in very small print that nobody will be able to read. I put this here because I wanted to put something into perspective, and that is this. On the left side, and in the first 5 lines of this side, is the David and Goliath material from the Old Testament once the late source material is removed. And you'll notice that the stuff in the Book of Mormon is very similar in structure, both in length and item following item. He actually seems to be following the story in a very detailed fashion, as if he's got one open in front of him while he's writing the other. And following that, going back to what I quoted about Brother Brown, when he said that he sees this increasing frequency of parallels in the Exodus material, I believe it's because Nephi's borrowing from other sources. He gets into the Exodus as they really get into their journey, but before that he doesn't know. How much time do I have left? What time is it? 4 minutes, okay. I have a lot more material here that deals with some of the earlier stuff, and so I'm going to cover just 1 or 2 points, and then for the rest of it you'll have to go out and buy the proceedings of this conference. Going back to this, it does a couple of interesting things, though. One of the things I want to point out is this. There's that long-standing anachronism in the Book of Mormon where we have this quote apparently by Nephi when he's getting ready to kill Laban. It's better one man should die and a nation should perish. We're all familiar with that. And then that same passage is more or less quoted verbatim by Caiaphas of Jesus Christ in the New Testament. If Nephi is borrowing here from an Old Testament tradition of David and Goliath, it stands to reason that there is the possibility that, in fact, Caiaphas is also borrowing from a tradition of David and Goliath. In an environment in which a quote like this stands to make absolute sense, how many people expected David to go out there and kill Goliath? There was only one, as I recall, and that was David himself. And so, in a sense, Israel is sending out one man to perish that the nation would not. It's an interesting timing. Second, and this is something else that's interesting here, and I'm just going to make a side note, is that here we have that another evidence that the brass plates were slightly different, and that Moses speaks, of course, to the Red Sea in parts that in the Old Testament he doesn't speak at all. He just waves his arms and the water goes through. The point is that if we can assume textual reliance here, we can probably assume it elsewhere. So we go back to the beginning of Lehi's calling, and I call this literary section the call of Moses and the trip to Sinai at the very beginning of 1 Nephi chapters 1 and 2. It's kind of funny, there's this footnote in 1 Nephi dealing with the pillar of fire that comes before Lehi on the rock. You remember that? This pillar shows up in the rock, and it's a little footnote at the bottom that was added some years ago in our scriptures, and it points us back to the pillar of fire that led the Israelites out of Egypt. Well, the truth is that according to my understanding, in fact, Lehi is going through the same process that Moses went through when he became a prophet.